Hello and welcome everyone to Notable's Driving the Data-Driven Enterprise series. For this episode, we have three talented guests joining us to share their experience, insights, and tips on data overload, how to manage too much data. I'm really excited to hear the insights that they've uncovered in their own work, so let's move right into introductions. Again, I'm Carol Willing. I'm the VP of Engineering at Notable and a longtime developer and leader in the Jupyter and Python communities. And co-hosting with me today is Michelle. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Bornasian. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Notable, and I am a data enthusiast. I try to bring data into everything that we do, whether it's marketing, customer experience, customer support. And so I'm excited to hear about how we unravel all of the data overload that many of us deal with every day.
Fantastic. And Blake, maybe you want to give us a quick hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Blake Burch. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Shipyard. We are a low-code data orchestration platform that helps teams launch, monitor, and share data workflows in less than 5 minutes. And a big passion point for me is trying to figure out how teams can automate their data and actually action on what they have on hand. So super excited to talk about that today.
We're grateful that you're here. And Will, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Oh, well, you're on mute.
Oops, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm Will Yang. I am the head of growth at Instrumentl. We make institutional fundraising easier by bringing grant prospecting, tracking, and management into one place. So I am usually working on some sort of growth initiative and like Michelle, quite the data enthusiast.
Fantastic. And we're looking forward to hearing your insights, Will, because you're working in an area that's near and dear to my heart with the grant funding. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is John Morrell. I'm a longtime data enthusiast. I've worked in the data management market for 25 plus years. I am currently the head of product marketing here at a company called Acceldata. And we are in a relatively new category of platforms called data observability, which basically takes all the things that you do in and around your systems or that you used to do for things like systems management, but we raise it up to the data level, right? We help you manage and control and get visibility to all your data pipelines, so that you can make them more reliable, increase your data quality, and ensure that the proper data is delivered to the right people at the right time.
Great. Thank you, John. And we've got a really diverse panel, so this should make for a really interesting discussion. Michelle, do you want to kick us off with the first question?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start at kind of the crux of this and think about, what really prevents companies from being more strategic in how they use data. So they've invested in having data, they've invested in the use of data, but how can they be more strategic so that they don't end up having this data overload and feeling a little bit of paralysis around that? Well, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that can be useful is to always go back into what are your key results for the quarter? Like, what are you working towards in your North Star? Ultimately, oftentimes with all this data overload, you can be looking at something that you think is interesting, but it's actually not going to drive that North Star metric. And so really thinking about what is the North Star metric? Is it clear yet? Or are we even measuring the right things before we start even, reading into the data can be a really great first step in terms of, feeling a little bit more order from all the chaos that you might be seeing.
It's a great answer. And I might come back to this North Star later, because I think figuring out that is a challenge as well. Blake, any thoughts on the question about being more strategic and how people use their data?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people, especially the data teams initially, focus a lot on getting their infrastructure right, making sure that everything is clean and getting all the data in one place, but they're not as focused on what results do they want to drive with the data? What ROI can actually be driven by business decisions that can be powered by data? And so oftentimes that means trying to go beyond dashboards themselves, and instead of just visualizing how things are performing, actually figuring out how you can connect things end to end to actually drive action on the data by thinking about things first from what business results do you want to drive all the way down to, okay, what do I need to set up to make sure that I can help facilitate that result for the business?
Thanks, Blake. I really love that, going beyond the dashboard and making data and the information that's within that data actionable within the business. So, John, do you have any thoughts on being more strategic in how people use their data?
So the companies I've worked with over the many years, right? And we're talking here about data overload, right? It's not just about the amount of data they have, but it's the ability to kind of process it and transform it in order so that the data actually reaches somebody that is very useful to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to make the data useful, you have to make sure you deliver it, right? And so it's really the reliability of these data pipelines that can keep companies from being more strategic in what they do. If the data doesn't flow effectively and the proper tools are not in place to ensure the proper flow of data, then the people won't get the data in a timely manner, and they lack trust in it. So they just won't use it. And to be more strategic, you have to make sure the data gets delivered reliably and effectively.
I think that's a really good point. And so delivering your data reliably, effectively, finding that North Star so you know where you're going. And then once you've got both of those, how do you go beyond the traditional dashboards and really act on the information within that data? Michelle, you want to maybe dig a little deeper into some of this overload concept with the next question?
Sure. Yeah. So it seems like there are really these two buckets of overload, right? So there could be request overload. Your team is getting inundated with people asking for requests, but then there's also the quantity overload, which I think is mostly what we're talking about here. We have so much data. I'm actually curious, I'd love to hear each of you speak to kind of tips on how to overcome both of those. So both the quantity overload and the request overload. Blake, let's start with you.
Yeah. So when it comes to the request overload, I think there's really like two angles you could kind of look at. The first one is just trying to make sure that you're assessing those requests a little bit more in depth, rather than taking everything that comes your data team's way. So figuring out like, what is this data going to be used for? How long is it going to be used for? Like, how are we going to validate that if we grab this, that this was actually useful for you to have on your side? But I think another way to potentially handle it is trying to set up systems internally to allow the data to be more self-service, so that you can ensure that the team themselves can grab data, whether it's from a visualization tool or a like orchestration tool or anything else like that. You want to help people take the basic requests and be able to solve that themselves. And part of that is also just like literacy for data and also just education about what data exists, how to access it, how to look at it, and that sort of thing. When it comes to the quantity of data, though, I think oftentimes, like I said, people get lost in trying to get all of the data available. And one thing that I always see missing is tracking what is the actual usage of the data. So when you have that data that's available, who is actually running queries against it and refreshing dashboards against it? What columns are being looked at continuously? Like, what's the frequency in which people are accessing this data? Because you don't necessarily need to focus on making sure that everything is in a good spot. You need to figure out what's driving the most value, what's being used the most, so that you can really hone in and make sure that that data is as useful as possible.
Thank you, Blake. Those are great insights. And Will, do you have thoughts on both the request overload and the quantity overload of data and how to overcome it?
Yeah, absolutely. So to speak on Blake, what we've done internally when it comes to data requests is we'll usually have a Kanban board where they can input in the respective requests that are going to be made. And from there, there's the prioritization process that takes place where we figure out what is the engineering requirements of whether or not this is something the engineering team needs, or it's something that we can, build through either no code or low code solutions and whatnot. And from there, that allows us to triage going into the next sprints, which ones we should actually prioritize with additional support, as opposed to the ones that just the business teams can manage. So that can be a really great way to manage requests, because it makes sure that everybody feels seen when they have these requests. It's not like we're just, hey, nice request. That's cool. So having that, is seen as really useful, just to make sure that people feel the incentive to want to bring up these sorts of requests going forward. And so we'll usually do that, and then we'll have some sort of retrospective process at the end of the quarter when we look at what didn't we get to, and can we prioritize that in the next quarter? Is it important for us to prioritize towards, the next quarter's key results and whatnot? On the other side of things, in terms of, just actually dealing with the quantity, I think that goes back to that North Star point that I was making earlier, which is our company operates off of biweekly sprints. And so from that standpoint, every single sub team has a clear key metric that everybody is reporting towards that drives the overall business's growth. And so by simplifying things down where we know, for example, that, X number of leads will lead to so many trials and so many trials will lead to so many conversions, there's essentially the sub bullet points of the little metrics that emerge as to what supports that superordinate metric, right? And so for us, what we're reporting on regularly through our all hands meetings and whatnot is, what were those 3 or 4 ingredients that drive our business forward in terms of our impact? And that's really what allows us to kind of filter through the noise of, hey, there's an interesting insight here, but at the end of the day, does it actually lead back to, for example, demand growing up in terms of demand gen, or does it actually lead to higher conversions for trial users into paid customers and whatnot? And I think that having that in place is always something that we use, at least within our small team. So we're a team of about 25 people or so. In making sure that just like everybody knows exactly like why are they here in this organization, what are we all working towards in terms of the overall objectives of our organization.
Super important, Will, and I absolutely agree. Like North Star and knowing why you're doing things and then taking the data actually to measure what you're doing is super effective. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. John, any thoughts and tips about request overload and quantity overload of data?
Well, see, both request and quantity overload, for both of them, many people believe that the only way to solve this is by hiring more qualified data engineers. But this is easier said than done, right? There's a real shortage of qualified data engineers. And when you can find them, they demand very, very high salaries, which can drive up your costs, right? Mm-hmm. So the best practice in order to overcome request overload is to make your data engineering team more productive and give them the right tools that helps them deliver the data better. So if you can give them the right tools that help ensure so that their data pipelines run reliably and deliver high quality data, then that kind of frees up their time from some data pipeline troubleshooting so that they can deal with more data requests and they can be much more effective and much more efficient in ensuring that there's high data quality and high data reliability.
Okay, I like that approach of maybe looking at them together. I think there was a common theme in this that self-service or giving people the opportunity to do things on their own was super important. But you all came at it from a different viewpoint. Is there any more depth that you can maybe give our listeners to on how they could go about achieving each of those, and maybe starting with self-service concept that Blake you had?
Yeah, I think it differs a whole lot for every single business, and I don't want to get things wrong here, where there's also some horror stories of what can happen with self-service. Like I used to be on a team that anyone could set up any data set of their own, which meant that you had 4 copies of the same data with slightly different columns and slightly different date ranges that were all mismatched too. It's important to kind of have things like really centralized, where you have one source of truth that people can access, like a data catalog or some sort of information about what tables and views exist, what data is in them, how those metrics are actually derived, and being able to provide that in a way that someone can interact with it. It could be teaching some of the team SQL and having them do that. It could be having different BI dashboard tools set on top of it. The tool that you use really doesn't matter as much as trying to make sure that the source of truth is in a spot that everyone recognizes, and that you've done the like educational work internally to ensure everyone is aware that it exists, how like they should be able to access it, so that they can help answer questions on their own.
Sounds good. And Will, maybe talk a second about the Kanban approach and prioritization and how that helps teams self-service as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that situation, so our submission form is pretty straightforward. It's essentially any typical Kanban approach where you input in what's the problem you're trying to solve, what exactly are the specs that you need, and then we essentially go through a story points process. And so in that situation, it's usually useful to we just have a intake form. It's a direct integration with our Slack for our organization. And so people are just able to directly make a request. From there, follow along with the guide as to just examples of what is a small request versus a big request. So for example, a small request could just be recently our CS team needed to find a certain activation metric for a particular feature. And so that's something in which that is not readily available through some sort of dashboard view right now. But what we're building is we would usually in our approaches, we would first build it. And then from there, we'd be asking the question of exactly what Blake's saying. How do we make this sustainable where they can pull it themselves going forward? And so it's usually a two-step sort of process where we first need to just piece it into the right place. And that kind of goes back to our earlier points that we talked about in sourcing of the data. And then from there, making it so that it's self-sufficient after we have validated that this is useful. This is exactly what the scoped out request was in the board itself.
Sounds great. And then John, you had some really interesting insights on how to get your data to the point where it could be useful for self-service. Do you want to talk a little bit more in depth on that?
Sure. And there's a key aspect to this that involves what I would call communication and collaboration, right? Mm-hmm. And so, earlier mentioned certain tools like data catalogs, right, and stuff like that. And there's other tools that can help the teams communicate more effectively and also collaborate, right? Mm-hmm. The key to self-service from an analyst standpoint or a business person's standpoint is to be able to be more explicit in terms of what they're looking for, right? And so if they can use the right tools to communicate effectively what they're looking for, then the data engineering teams can come back and stop and say, okay, I know what you're looking for. They can build out the right data sets that they're looking for. But in the process of building those, the two teams can still continuously collaborate and say, hey, is this what you're looking for? No, it's not exactly what I was looking for. Can you tweak this? And so if you can create this collaborative process between people, and so that they can create just the right data set, and then create things like quality metrics around it, right? So if the data gets out of range in this particular way, please let me know about it, right? Or if that means it's not of the best quality to me. And so again, through all this collaboration inside of these tools, the business can declare what they're looking for. The data engineering team knows better what they need to build, and the whole process shrinks. But also in that shrunk process, then the teams more explicitly build exactly what they're looking for.
John, that's great. And I think there was a common theme that everyone had, which is really, it's an iterative approach, and, the communication between people in a company is critical for kind of getting the right solution. Michelle, you want to take us to the next question before we get overloaded on data overload?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually picking up on something, John, you said, and I wrote it down, there's shortage of high quality data engineers and the cost behind that. And so if you think about like a smaller company that may have less resources, or maybe a company who is just starting to become more data driven, where they haven't put a ton of resources to it quite yet. How would you recommend, or maybe there's a specific tip that you would recommend for somebody who's just getting started or a smart company with less resources to overcome the data overload and actually maybe use it as an asset to spark the growth? So Will, let's start with you.
Cool. I mean, I think when it comes to getting your foundation set, it can be as simple as starting small with something like heap analytics or Mixpanel and setting up just different events across your site. You don't necessarily have to know exactly what you want to track yet, but you should put the tracking in place so that when you are ready to track, that you have the actual events being delivered back. In terms of like the smaller budget sort of thing, we aren't really limited on that side of things, because ultimately we know what drives business, which is at the end of the day, we need to drive more people to try our product, and they need to experience this free trial. Like, why are we overcomplicating this, right? And so the metric that, largely on my growth team that we've been focused on for the last year and a half is how many qualified leads are we generating every single week? And so we've been able to effectively double that year, in the last year, because we've just zeroed in on that number. And then we're figuring out what is the sourcing coming from, what are the places for attribution, which I'm sure Michelle, like marketing, it's a common challenge across the board of any marketing team. But essentially what we're trying to figure out is it can be something as simple as literally our sales rep, when they're talking to the person, how did you hear about us? And from there, logging that response and going into a team meeting and saying, hey, of the 20 people that respond to this, 30% of them are saying they found it from our workshops, right? And so I think that a lot of times people get too caught up in trying to engineer this perfect end state dream solution when they're, looking ahead to when they're a 200 plus person company or something like that. And at the end of the day, that's not where you're at right now. So acknowledge where you're at and measure what you can measure and measure what you can control, separate out what you can control and what you can't control in terms of the metrics. And then from there, you should be able to build at least a very basic dashboard using any basic, Google Data Studio, or just in general. Like, there's so many free tools out there these days that it shouldn't be a limiting factor for your ability to grow your business. And I think that's especially true for earlier stage companies. And that's where, like, on the side, I mentor different startups, and like they always come to me with these sorts of questions. And I tell them, like, it's like, what do you already have? Start there. Like, there's no reason to kind of reinvent the wheel here in terms of, places to get in terms of what you want to do next with your data.
Sounds great. Well, John, you have any thoughts about how do you do more with less?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, my experience, in particular recently, right, is a lot of smaller companies have kind of moved to the cloud and doing a lot of their work in the cloud, right? They feel the data engineering crunch even more so than the larger companies, even more so than the enterprises. The enterprises have all these human resources assets that they can use in order to find data engineers, and they got the money to pay for them. Smaller companies don't have those resources, and they have struggled to even pay the data engineering talent. So what they need to be able to do is to be able to more effectively work with their data. The other key thing here is smaller companies tend to be ones with very unique and modern business models, right? And they'll use data as their competitive advantage, and they'll use data to drive that business model, which in the end helps them get that advantage in the market, create their unique niche in the market, and to be able to more effectively deliver on those products and services to their clients. Tools that can make these smaller data teams more productive and ensure their kind of reliable, timely delivery of high quality data ensures they can use the data to their advantage, right? I worked recently with a company that prides itself in decisions on loans within 2 hours, and the ability to close on the loan within 24 hours and deliver that data to them, okay? They couldn't deliver that business model if the people didn't have the right data on the business side. The people on the business side didn't have the right data in front of them, and they couldn't trust the data, right?
Sure.
So in order, right? So again, making sure that, one, the data gets there in a timely fashion, right? That they have the most fresh data in their hands in order to make those decisions and close out on somebody in 2 hours is critically important to their business model. The other side of it is to make sure that the data is of extremely high quality. And the quality is particularly important because they're going to make a decision really, really quickly on this data, and it has to be the right decision to make. So again, high quality and reliable delivery are the key things that help drive a lot of these new, smaller company business models.
Sounds great, John. I want to make sure we get a chance for Blake to sort of share his thoughts on either what has been said or his own perspective on, smaller companies with less resources. How do they go about this?
Yeah, I really agree with Will in terms of like the initial setup. Like my lane is trying to make sure that you can get as much event data as possible initially through something like a segment or rudder stack. You can always figure out how to refine it after the fact to be able to look at the specific things you want to. But you have to think about like what sort of operation is actually driving like the business model, and go after that specific operation and try and figure out how can I make the data like automate or improve this process continuously. So if it's something where you're trying to get more like lead gen through your sales efforts, how can you streamline each of those processes or provide better data in the process to make sure that you're able to get more qualified like leads over time? I think grabbing everything that you can initially, but starting small with a specific focus and figuring out how to achieve that fully with the data, you're going to see more success to where you can eventually move on to other efforts and try and streamline more aspects of the business overall.
Thank you, Blake. Great responses from all of our panelists. And I want to just remind folks that are listening in that we'll be publishing a recap of this after the event, and some of these great tips will be available and curated for all of you. Michelle, since we're kind of getting close on time, you want to go for our last question, maybe our quick fire round?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you all for your insight. So to close, sometimes it can feel like data is locked within a data team or a specific data-centric person, and someone, perhaps like me on the marketing team or someone in customer success or sales who wants to use data more, can feel like they don't have access to it, or it's a little bit more challenging. So I'm curious, what advice do you have for someone who isn't a data analyst or scientist, but wants to become more data-driven? What advice would you have for them? John, let's start with you.
So I think the key is, again, giving that sort of business person, let's call them a business person, right? Because they're not an analyst, they're not a data scientist, right? Giving that business person the ability to know what data is out there and give them the ability to explore it and better understand it. And by exploring it, I don't just sort of mean, hey, let me kind of see what this data looks like, right? Give them the ability to understand, what is this data used for? Who else uses it? How reliable is it? How often does it get delivered? What is in the data? What does it mean to all the various people? There's lots of different attributes you can have in and around the data, right? What's the level of quality of this data as it is delivered, right? And so giving that sort of business person who wants to use more data greater visibility into all of the data that's available to them, and let them sort of peruse through it and figure out, hey, this is a set of data that's really, really good for me. I want to use it and can help me solve problem X.
Sounds great. Blake, what are your pro tips?
It might be kind of a controversial take, but I think a lot of people can really learn SQL, that it's not as difficult as it seems on the surface, because a lot of people already know basic Excel formulas like SUMIFs, COUNTIFs, and they understand I have data in this sheet and I have data in this other sheet. And it's no different being able to like grab specific data from a table and then join it to data that exists on another table. I think there's tools like SQL Bolt Online to kind of teach yourself that, but it kind of gets you into a frame of mind where you understand like, how is this stuff actually stored and how do I actually retrieve it, rather than it being a nebulous concept that you come to the data team with like, hey, I want access to this data. Because as soon as you can start thinking through like where it's stored, what information is actually available, you can start like figuring out better requests about, hey, are we able to capture this data point and like add it in here? And if so, I'd love to be able to like pull that on my own or something like that. It seems like it might be technical, but we had a lot of success at my last role, like teaching the whole company like how to use SQL. And not everyone could do it in their day-to-day work, but they at least had literacy to understand it and understand how everything was broken out. So
thank you, Blake. And I actually, Michelle, I think this would be a great topic for a future webinar, just how SQL fits in with things. Will, real quickly, what are your pro tips for being more data-driven?
Yeah, I think Blake hit it on the head in terms of literacy. Like something that you might want to try within your organization that we'll typically do is, if somebody is, like Michelle said, not as familiar on the data side of things, we'll pair somebody who is to essentially talk through, what are some of the considerations of their lens. So just kind of taking them through the more experienced person's shoes of like, these are the things that I think about when solving this particular problem, can help them understand the sort of world they can craft of data as well. And so having that sort of training wheels approach can be really great. And then what we usually have as like a key outcome for folks from there is they can just prep a one page of like, these are the things that I would like to build towards. And like, based off my conversation with XYZ person, I think this is viable. I think this is probably something in V2 or V3. And so it makes it a lot more tangible in terms of just feeling like we're actually making progress towards A, teaching the literacy side of things, but B, again, going back to the business outcomes and like what is actually helpful for our overall organization. So definitely recommend that sort of approach. We've actually been lucky because in our current state of our CRM, where we use the CRM called Close, their reporting features are absolutely not super great. And so literally like all their filters though are effectively like SQL queries. And so like it effectively teaches like our AEs gradually these different sides of what data is available to them. And like, then what we'll do in our onboarding series is we'll just have a question that's like, if I wanted to find the answer to this, what sort of query would you pull in like Close? And so those are good ways to kind of build up that literacy over time in the first 90 days of an employee as well as later on in their journey with you.
Thanks, Will. And in closing, I want to, on behalf of Michelle, my co-host, and the whole Notable team, thank you to our panelists, Will, Blake, and John, for sharing their insights and their time with us. And I want to thank all of the audience members for joining. We'll be providing in the blog posts ways to connect with each of these fine folks. And until then, please join us for the next webinar episode in Driving the Data-Driven Enterprise. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks much.
Thank you.